From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast, and I'm Ryan Evans. On this episode, I'm joined by Jessica Groskopf, a Nebraska Extension agricultural economist, to discuss one approach to wealth transfer and estate planning within farm families. Jessica has published the third article in a series that is highlighting different tactics for bringing family members back into the operation. And today we'll be focusing on the concept of combining gifts with lease agreements as a means of transferring assets between generations, all while ensuring the viability of the farm or ranch. This not only addresses the complexities of estate planning, but also maintains the standard of living for all parties. And we'll find out some strategies to do just that right now from Jessica Groskopf. Again, thanks for joining me, Jessica.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So just to start with the purpose behind this series of articles, I mentioned this is the third now, which listeners can find on our website, cap.unl.edu. It's linked to in the podcast notes if you're listening on a podcast service. Just the purpose behind it, what are some challenges that are facing farm and ranch families when it comes to transferring assets between generations?
Yeah, so the purpose behind this series of articles is really to kind of lay out all of those options that are available to farm and ranch families. A lot of times when we think about farm estate and transition planning, often our mind just goes to a will or to a trust, but there can be tactics like the one we're going to talk about today that can take place while that owner generation is living and still allow that heir to come into the operation and both sides still have a viable standard of living. So my hope with this series of articles is just to give folks an idea and maybe some different ideas than what their advisory teams are offering them, just to help them start those conversations and see if one of these tactics might be one that works for them.
Great. And in these articles, you use some terms that we'll just kind of establish right now so that people know what we're talking about. We'll probably use the term donor and donee quite a bit when you're talking about a donor as someone who is gifting the land, making the gift or asset, whatever it is, and then the donee being the party receiving that gift. And so in your newest article, you discuss combining gifting with lease agreements. So how does that strategy work?
Yeah, so I think there's some challenges when we talk about straight gifting while that owner generation is still alive. And what happens with that is a lot of times someone in that owner generation doesn't want to gift an asset because frankly, they still need that asset in order to be able to operate their business effectively. And so when we talk about combining a gift with a lease agreement, what happens is that donor gifts that asset, whether it's land, machinery, equipment, maybe even livestock, to the donee, which is usually that on-farm heir or a child. They can make that gift and then lease that gift back from the donee. So still keeping that asset basically in the business itself, providing that child with that opportunity to generate income, have some ownership, but that donor with that opportunity to still have some use of that asset, even though they no longer have control of that asset.
So what are some of the potential benefits for both parties, the donor and the donee who is receiving the gift?
The biggest benefit for the donor is that they continue to have access to that asset, allowing them to maintain their standard of living. That asset is also removed from their estate. And if it's completed outside of the applicable look-back periods, it will reduce the assets counted towards long-term care and potentially estate tax. And then depending on the nature of the asset, it might also decrease that donor's property taxes. Finally, if it is a true lease agreement, that donor has the ability to deduct that rent as a business expense, potentially lowering their income tax liability. So there's a lot of benefits on the donor side. There is a risk, though, to the donor that I think really needs to be emphasized. And the fact is that they still are gifting that asset to the donee. So If that donee, and let's just imagine for a minute that that's maybe a child, if their child decides that they no longer want to lease to the donor, they don't have to, right? So it's a true it's a true gift and it's a true lease agreement. So both parties have the ability to break or terminate that lease, and that can be a challenge for the donor. If we look at the donee side, there's the benefit of receiving the asset of the gift, and then also they would receive the income from the lease, which is really important. Another thing that might be available to the donee is that if that asset was depreciable and it has depreciable value still associated with it, they might be able to depreciate that asset out as well. So there's quite a few benefits there for the donee as well. And again, it's kind of a benefit to them that if that relationship, that lease relationship isn't working, they can break the lease or terminate the lease.
So land, machinery, and equipment are all potential assets for this strategy, as you highlight in the article. Are there specific considerations or differences in implementing a gift leaseback scenario for each of these different types of assets?
So you need a rock star team around you to implement this type of a strategy. So in the first series of articles, I think we talked about getting together a lawyer, a tax professional, your banker, those kinds of advisors around you to ask them about the implications of this type of strategy. We know that the IRS is very critical of these types of transactions, and we want that team around us to make sure that the gift is done properly and the lease is structured properly so that we don't have any tax implications of utilizing a gift leaseback. And we also have to be thoughtful about what types of assets you use. Again, we talked about land, machinery, and equipment. Those are assets that are traditionally leased in farm and ranch operations, and so they're the most likely to be acceptable in this kind of scenario. But again, go back, especially to your attorney and to your tax professional. Make sure that it's structured properly and that both of those advisors are aware of the fact that you would like to implement this kind of strategy so that everybody's on the same page and it's executed in a way that doesn't trigger some sort of tax liability.
That's great. I was going to ask you about that because you mentioned, as you close the article, that these are subject to such scrutiny from the IRS. And you've mentioned some of the guidelines, precautions that you can take, primarily working with that good team of professionals around you. Do you know or have an idea of what the IRS, what the red flags are for them, what they're looking for, why they would come down on a situation like this?
So they really want to make sure that it's a true gift. So again, if you're the donor gifting this asset to the donee, you need to make sure that it's a true gift in terms of what the value of that gift was and that you are absolutely relinquishing control of that gift. To my understanding, that's kind of step number one. Then we also need to make sure that the lease is happening at basically fair market value. So we need to make sure that all of those ducks are in a row. The other piece that I think is really important is having a written lease agreement in this scenario and that lease agreement is followed. So I think, again, getting that team of advisors around you, making sure it's done properly, and having very good documentation, and also realizing if I'm gifting something, I'm losing control of that asset. And I think sometimes we forget about that. When I gift it, I no longer get to dictate what happens there. If it's a true gift, that donee has the opportunity to do with that gift what they see fit, which includes leasing to somebody else or potentially selling that asset.
Yeah, well, great information to keep in mind here. And we encourage listeners to do check out the other articles in this series that Jessica has authored. The last one was on gifting, and she also has one out there that came out earlier this year on employing family members on the operation. And again, you can find your way back to all of those through our website at cap.unl.edu. Thanks so much, Jessica.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.